Hello, and welcome to Manta's Overtime Compliance Academy. This expert-level overtime compliance course will provide you with tactics and tools for balancing your staffing levels and keeping your overtime expenses within a payroll budget. The first two courses in this series provided a basic explanation of federal overtime regulations under the Fair Labor Standards Act. They also suggested methods for checking whether your employees are correctly classified as exempt or non-exempt from overtime pay. This course will walk you through the formula for comparing the cost of raising employee salaries versus reclassifying them as hourly workers eligible for overtime. It will also provide a few options to track and minimize employee overtime hours. To help you manage your overtime expenses in compliance with federal rules, this Academy course features operational insights from the U.S. Department of Labor and Manta CEO John Swansinger. Before we consider how you can best manage your overtime expenses, let's review your overtime-related responsibilities as a small employer under the FLSA. As an employer, you're required to pay employees overtime wages of time and a half for any hours they work over 40, unless they meet the requirements to be classified as overtime exempt. There are two tests to determine if an employee is exempt from receiving overtime pay under federal law: a salary test and a duties test. You, the employer, are responsible for making sure your employees perform the right kind of duties before you can count them as ineligible for overtime pay. You're also responsible for paying overtime-exempt employees a minimum annual salary. In May 2016, the Obama administration enacted an FLSA rule change which raised the minimum annual salary employers must pay in order to classify employees as exempt from overtime. The $23,660 minimum salary threshold has now doubled to $47,476 a year. Employers have until December 1st, 2016 to meet this new pay requirement. The Department of Labor estimates that new salary threshold change will affect 211,000 small businesses and their 1.8 million employees. The Advocacy Office of the U.S. Small Business Administration says the rule change will have a varied financial impact on employers depending on their industries and regions. While the Department of Labor estimates that the average business will see an additional $320 to $2,700 in payroll costs as a result of the rule change, the Advocacy Office says that that figure is more likely to be in the thousands of dollars per year for a small employer. In addition to the additional payroll costs, small employers will likely incur up to $600 in management expenses implementing the changes. Owners will also need to spend time implementing new overtime and salary policies, adjusting payroll, and tracking employee work hours to avoid additional overtime expenses. It's important for small employers to form a plan to keep those payroll and overtime costs under control. Employers have two main options: raise the salaries of exempt white-collar workers to $47,476 or more, then you can keep classifying them as exempt from overtime pay. Or reclassify those salaried employees as hourly and eligible for overtime pay for any hours over 40 they work in a work week. Manta CEO John Swansinger recommends business owners review the overtime status of salaried employees like administrators, managers, sales, and professional staff. Look at how many hours your employees work, Swansinger recommends. In some cases, it makes more financial sense to keep current salaries and pay employees overtime. However, for employees that work many hours over 40, or for those who are already close to the new salary threshold, small business owners can raise salaries to match the new regulations and avoid overtime costs. Deciding whether to raise employee salaries or reclassify them as overtime eligible can be done by running a simple, though time-consuming calculation. For each employee that will be affected by the salary change, do the following math. Subtract their current salary from the new minimum salary. This is your additional payroll expense for a raise. So, for example, raising the salary of an employee who made the old threshold $23,660 to the new threshold of $47,476 would cost you an additional $23,816 a year in payroll. To calculate how much it would cost you to pay that employee an hourly wage plus overtime, figure the hourly rate based on a 40-hour work week for 52 weeks a year. For the employee in this example, that hourly rate works out to $11.38. Estimate how many overtime hours that employee works every week on average. For this example, let's say the employee works an average of 50 hours a week. That's 10 hours overtime a week, 520 overtime hours a year. At the FLSA mandated time and a half overtime rate, that's an additional $8,882 in payroll costs for reclassifying that employee as an hourly employee eligible for overtime. In this instance, raising the exempt employee's salary to the new minimum would cost you an additional $23,816 a year, while reclassifying would cost you an additional $8,882. For an employee like this, who works a minimal amount of overtime, you would lessen the impact of the FLSA salary increase by switching that employee from exempt to non-exempt, from salary to hourly plus overtime wages. In this scenario, reclassifying, though, would still leave you with significant additional payroll expenses. Small employers who reclassify their exempt employees will need to manage their scheduling and track employee hours in order to minimize overtime expenses. Begin by taking the following steps. Edit your workplace policy to include strict rules around work hours, logging breaks, and keeping hour logs. Use a major payroll platform like ADP, QuickBooks, and Salesforce, which have time tracking capability. Try a new mobile app or timekeeping platform like Toggle, T-Sheets, ClockShark for construction contractors, or Cheddar Suite for restaurants to track hours, calculate, and pre-approve employee overtime hours. Consider hiring part-time, seasonal, or contract workers to avoid overtime expenses. Be sure to run this calculation on all of your overtime exempt employees who are currently making less than the new $913 weekly minimum salary. Managers and assistant managers, administrative staff, paralegals, executive assistants, and outside salespeople. Everyone, including small employers, have until December 1st, 2016 to raise salaries or reclassify employees as overtime eligible. If you're concerned about how to meet the new salary requirements, the Department of Labor has staff available to guide you through the change. Seek assistance in person at the DOL Wage and Hour Division office in your area. Follow the link in this slide to find the office nearest you. You can also request assistance from the Department of Labor by calling 866-487-9243. To guarantee you're classifying overtime-exempt employees in compliance with new and existing overtime rules, our experts recommend taking one of the following steps: hiring a law firm or HR consultant, or if you have more than a handful of employees and you're preparing to expand, consult with a labor and employment lawyer. Congratulations on completing Manta's Overtime Compliance Academy, and thank you for taking part. We hope you leave with a better understanding of how to classify your employees in accordance with federal overtime regulations and keep your costs under control in light of these new regulations. Thanks, and do good business.